2013, Michael, there was an investigative reporter in town who's sitting with us here, Sarah Karp from Catalyst Chicago, broke a story about a $20 million no-bid contract the Chicago Public Schools had led to what I'll call a superintendent and principal training program. In fact, the organization is called Soup's Academy, and it's not because of the kind of soup they're making for lunch, but it's short for superintendent. Sarah Karp, thanks for joining us today. I guess I want to start by asking you to just summarize why this story from 2 years ago is suddenly back in the news this week.
Well, after I did the original story, the Inspector General launched an investigation, and for the last 2 years when I've been talking to either the current Inspector General or the former one, they've continually said that they're still looking into it. That they immediately, once they read my story, they immediately thought there's something fishy here, and then they've sort of stayed on it. And, I did not know that there was a federal investigation. I guess there's been a grand jury meeting for a year, and they just issued subpoenas and asked for some documents this week. But what I did know was that for some reason the Inspector General wasn't just putting it on his shelf.
And the Inspector General is the city's official investigator for potential conflicts of interest and wrongdoing?
This is the CPS Inspector General,
okay.
But that's exactly what they do.
So why did this story pop up a week after the election?
Well, I was going to ask that, but go ahead.
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I'd love to see some emails, but or some phone or hear some phone conversations. I have heard from people who've covered and who look at federal investigations more regularly than I do, that sometimes the federal government, the FBI, the U.S. District Attorney, will have deference to an election. So they do not want to be in a position where they sway an election, and they also don't want to be in a position where they mess up their investigation through an election. So that might have been a reason. I mean, they might have been holding on to it. But it also, I guess, it also could be not a coincidence, but it could be that the grand jury at this moment was at the point where they needed this stuff. So, I really don't know, but it sure does make people say, well, what if people would have known this 2 weeks ago? What would have they said?
The mayor seemed to be actually somewhat flummoxed when this first came up.
Well,
and not really ready with a soundbite in response.
And you have to think about that at the moment that we think they all found out that these subpoenas came down, Barbara Byrd Bennett, Rahm Emanuel, Bruce Rauner, were all sitting at this luncheon, and then and Barbara Byrd Bennett had told reporters, "Hey, I'll talk to you guys after this," because this was all a luncheon, and ironically, this was a luncheon about principal training, and then I was not at the luncheon, my colleague was, but she said then. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Rahm Emanuel just gets up in the middle of the luncheon after his comments and just leaves. Then Barbara Byrd Bennett, after the luncheon, goes darting out, hops into an elevator. All the reporters are following them. All the press people are like, no, you can't get to her. So the hypothesis is that during that luncheon, there was some sort of little, whether it was email or text or something holy crap, get to the office. And they might have been taken by some surprise.
The whole thing about deference to election, the next segment of the show, or the final segment, will be talking about the reparations. And I think that the line is that they held back the agreement to go forward with the reparations because of the election. Didn't want to make it look like Rahm was doing that so I'm just throwing that in there.
Yeah, so there are considerations, but...
So as a result of the story re-breaking this week, the school CEO, Barbara Byrd Bennett, has taken a leave of absence.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about Ruiz, the guy who's come in her place, other than he has served 6 years on some state education board?
Yeah, and he is a political appointee. He is not an educator. There's some question that do we really need an educator right now? I mean, it's an interim. I do not see him changing professions. One thing that I can say about him is that during board meetings, he abstains from a ton of votes because his law firm, Drinker and Biddle, is involved in has a lot of clients that do business with Chicago Public Schools. So, it's kind of crazy that the CEO, who now will be in position to recommend that people vote on things. I mean, in this type of structure,
much less negotiate the new contract with the teachers.
Right, is somebody who has whose law firm has a lot of relationships with just a lot of vendors. So I don't really know how that will work. I mean, I did ask at the press conference yesterday that Board President David Vitale and Ruiz had, why not pick Carlos Escocha? Why not pick Mahalia Hines? Whatever you might think about her, at least they're educators.
Right.
And there would be, and at least you could say, well, they would have some idea if you felt like you had to pick a board member. But they said that their explanation was that Ruiz has been in Springfield and therefore would do a good job working with Springfield to try and get CPS more money. Of course, he could do that as a board member too. He doesn't have to be CEO to be a effective lobbyist for CPS.
I should point out that apparently he's not going to collect a salary, but while she's on a leave of absence, Ms. Bennett will be still collecting her salary.
Well, she's got a lot of leave days, I guess, banked. They would not clarify if it was sick and vacation days or if it was just vacation days. But the interesting thing about that is that, teachers, I got a bunch of emails and texts from teachers saying that when we take sick days, we have to bring a doctor's note. So I hope they get her doctor's note.
Sarah, let me ask you, what are the actual details of this possible scandal or the whole issue? For the listeners out there and for me, fill us in about just what do you think is going on?
Well, Barbara Bennett worked for Soups prior to coming to CPS. And there's some indication that she might have done some work after she was working for CPS, but she always denied that she was getting, to me, she's always said that that she wasn't really getting paid for that work. But most of what I wrote about could be identified as a conflict of interest, perhaps, or maybe an ethical issue. But what I think, what I know is that the federal government, the district attorney and the FBI, they don't give a crap about ethical issues. They give a crap about if you broke the law. And this is a criminal investigation, so I can only imagine that there's something that I don't know, that they don't know, that I don't know and they know, that that is entering into this. So I think that one thing to keep in mind, I've been saying this kind of from the beginning, is that the way that Soups is set up seems very ripe for people to for there to be some insidious relationships, because the people who do the training are current and former superintendents, and also who is Soups trying to get contracts from? The school districts from which those superintendents work. So there's just this circular relationship. And by the way, these guys that own Soups, they also own a search firm for superintendents, so they can help some superintendents get jobs.
The name of which is?
Proact. They also own their agency also does training for superintendents. So if you're an aspiring superintendent. In addition, they've started this business called Synesy, which is tries to help school districts turn around schools, and they wanted to become a vendor in Illinois, and Illinois rejected them as a vendor. So that's one reason why CPS has not been able to use them. Who knows if they would have, but certainly that's why they were trying.
Do you think why were they rejected? Was that because of the last governor, and maybe would this governor change his mind had this crisis not happened?
Maybe, and it was under the last governor that they were rejected, and it wasn't really clear why they were rejected.
So, have you talked to Carlos Escocia, who's this experienced principal and progressive educator who somehow ended up on the Board of Education, a phenomenal guy? I don't know why he'd want the job, but he's on the board, and to my mind, he would have been a natural leader, given the competing forces in play, particularly around budget issues and the teacher's contract.
Well, when asked, and we did talk to him, he kind of chuckled, and he's a very, well, you're right. He's a progressive educator. He's been around for a long time. He would, to me, have been a more natural choice. He's very careful not to sort of criticize what's going on, and he didn't want to say. He just said he said he didn't get the call. Nobody called him. Nobody asked him, and he heard about Ruiz becoming interim. 3 minutes before we did, basically.
Is this guy an opposition person on the Chicago Public School Board?
Ruiz? No, Ruiz.
The educator you're talking about?
Oh,
the
that's
professor?
going to. He has stood up on some positions, but he's not like some crazy renegade that always votes no. That's not him. But he
Not
does.
like I would be probably.
Well, I mean, so he does bring up some points, and the thing is that he is very firmly a neighborhood schools guy, and I don't know if he would feel comfortable carrying out everything that the mayor wanted to be carried out, and Ruiz probably will.
If the Barbara Bird Bennett leave of absence hadn't happened this week, obviously this story, until some resolution comes, is going to hang over these other pressing issues. But what would you have been talking about as you get ready to put another catalyst issue off to the printer? What would you be saying about this huge overhang of a budget deficit and pension problem that clearly the mayor is hoping for a Supreme Court decision that goes his way and help from the legislature, when there doesn't seem to be any money, or the legal experts think that court case is going to go very far in the mayor's favor?
Yeah, I think they have a huge problem. I always say that Chicago Public School budget people are among the most creative human beings I've ever met, because every year they come up with something new, but I don't really know what new they're going to come up with here to fill the hole.
Are we going to hear more about bankruptcy?
I don't know how realistic that is, because for one thing, the state would have to adopt a federal law. The state has yet to adopt a federal law, so you'd have to get people in the state legislature to approve it. And from what I hear, that's mostly a very conservative idea, and not something that's gonna sort of percolate among all the state lawmakers. But I would not be surprised if there is some way, some emergency thing that comes up that does help them out of some of these. It helps them, renegotiate things, re that, in order to help solve some of this issue.
Let me ask, what are the implications of this? I mean, what if various outcomes happen, if it goes forward and they're found to be wrongdoing, what do you think the mayor's moves might be, and what do you think of the mayor's response to this story unfolding in his, when asked about his support of the current Barbara Bird Bennett?
Well, the minute that he said no comment when asked if he had confidence, I was like, oh, she's gone. I mean, we'd already been hearing that she was gone, but I mean, if I was saying, like, usually the mayor and whatnot, they say, I support the person until they're being let out in handcuffs, and then they suddenly don't support them, right? But so I really thought that was a death knell for her. And I think this leave of absence is, well, first of all, they have themselves in a wee bit of a bind because of when this news came out. Because they had to, both the CPS and Barbara Bird Bennett had to indicate that they wanted this contract, that her contract, to be ended by March 31st. Well, this is not it's past March 31st. So now, basically, she has the power. If she says, I want my contract extended, then the only way they can get out of it is to fire her for cause. And, if she gets indicted, there's cause. But otherwise, they're going to have to figure out how do they fire her for cause, or they pay her for another year.
Can you shed any light on other contracts and arrangements that the CPS has that might be in a similar vein of this and might be questionable?
Well, there's a lot of dealings. I mean, whether you talk about Deborah Quazzo, who's a board member, and the fact that her tech companies, are doing, a bang-up business with CPS, or you talk about the fact that there's, these that David Vitale is in the whole financial world, and we also have all these like bonds and all the these crazy deals, and Vitale was saying yesterday, well, hey, we've all had lives previous to coming to CPS, so that's no big deal. But I think that the larger point to me is that as more and more government in general gets privatized, that it's very important for journalists and for watchdogs in general to pay close attention, because while it doesn't necessarily preclude a business from getting work with the government just because somebody in charge had some prior relationship, it does set the wrong tone. And also you have to sort of look out for, is there some financial way in which they're still benefiting, or which they could benefit in the future, and it's a very dangerous and slippery slope. But I think that's in general why privatization has some has inherent dangers to it.
Well, haven't you also covered the surge in high school graduation rates, which some activists argue is because of the privatization of, in effect, online GED testing? I know that's not what it's called, but that seems to me, as the casual reader, that's kind of what CPS has done, is they run people through an online program, and then they get assigned as a graduate of, say, a Sullivan or a Lane Tech or something, even though they haven't been inside that building for years.
Right, and this is a story that Becky Vivi from BZ and I did together, right before this, and if this is another thing that is very, very suspect. It's not necessarily because we were able to identify like a very, very clear conflict of interest, but more so, these are sort of for-profit organizations that are getting a ton of money to provide basically half-day programs for kids, where they go in, they're put in front of a computer. If they need help, the teacher comes over and helps them, but I'm not really clear if it helps them or does the work for them, or what is the relationship between the teacher and the kid. But then, I mean, the saddest thing about this is that, yes, this kid is counted as a graduate. Yes, this kid has a diploma. But can this young person go to a college? Or can this young person even learn, you talk about the social skills of going to school, being at school at 8 o'clock. There's a socialization about that, right? These programs, they're 2 times a day, and they're like 3 hours a day. And if this is what you're being told is good enough for you to get a diploma, how are you then going to transfer even into just a job that you have to come at 9 o'clock? I mean, I was sitting there where kids would just trickle in, and nobody would say anything. They'd trickle in, do an hour of work, and trickle out. This is, I mean, and what does that teach you about how you're supposed to, and the crazy thing is that board members, after we wrote those stories, I mean, more than one board member was like, I was shocked that this is how these schools operate. Well, I mean, what information are these board members getting? They all voted on these. They all voted on them. I mean, and truthfully, when we saw these on the board report, and this is another situation where, you heard about it one day, and before you could even, look up, they were being approved. We were like, what are these places? But why? Andrea Zopp, Mahalia Hines, Escoicha, Ruiz, Vitale, Quazzo, Henry Beenan, who's, the former head of a university, doesn't say, okay, we're approving these schools. What type of education are they offering? I mean, you just have to wonder what, I mean, that to me is almost as bad as, having as a conflict of interest. I mean, this is their job, is education.
Before we send you out to soccer practice with your son, I want to raise one other issue because of its pertinence with what's going on in Rogers Park right now. We know because of the 50 or 49 school closings that there's additional school closings are frozen for 5 years, but apparently pre-existing charters are not, and there are rumors about Noble School coming in with a new high school in Rogers Park. We already have a Chicago Math and Science Academy and an UNO, and a recovering Sullivan Neighborhood High School that's really had great stuff, but its enrollment is dropping. Is competition for the budget dollars between charters and regular public schools beginning to impact regular neighborhood public schools?
Well, it's not just beginning. It has. I mean, it has decimated neighborhood schools in Chicago. I mean, you have high schools that have 300 kids. You have high schools that have 400 kids. You talk about this is the other side of it. So we create these for-profit little schools. They hurt Sullivan. There's a Pathways right near Sullivan. There's kids that are going over to Pathways. You can get your diploma going to school 2 days a week, 3 hours a day. And then there's Nobles and Chicago Math and Science. I mean, but then if you get a school like Sullivan, you get a student, a young person, a 13, 14-year-old, they just say, I'm going to my neighborhood school. I don't have other options. This is where I'm going to go. What kind of school are they walking into? Does that school have enough kids to support things like an honors English class, an honors math class, a band program?
Art. Athletics.
Does it have any of these things?
A newspaper?
A newspaper. Well, there's none of this. So then we're sending these kids into these anemic high schools, and it's just not. And then we're surprised when they're like, "Oh, I'm bored and I'm going to drop out," because there's nothing there, because the school can't support anything.
Well, Sarah Karp of Catalyst Chicago, keep up the incredible investigative journalism work. It's a small, steady staff that gets this thing done every month. I want to tip my hat to Lorraine Forte, because she's really, as your editor, has really pushed these stories along, and we'll be looking for the next issue in a few weeks.
Great. Thank you again.
Best of luck to you, Sarah.
Right.
You know, I want to say that as we go out from this segment, the privatization of the public sector really demeans democracy, and people need to be aware of that. That whether it's private contractors in the park selling food, or whatever it is, we really have undermined our public sector, and democracy is suffering.